The executive order objects to what Trump calls a revisionist movement that's looking to undermine the remarkable achievements of the United States, in his words. And he claims that the Smithsonian specifically is promoting divisive, race-centered ideology.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. To say that the last few months have been chaos in the United States would probably be an understatement. Donald J. Trump returned to office powered by an angry culture wars politics. And in a barrage of executive orders, he has sought to upend the relationship of government to arts and culture, from canceling grants to personally making himself the boss of the Kennedy Center. It is very hard to keep up with all this. But one person who has been trying is art critic and journalist Brian Boucher, who has written story after story for ArtNet about the unfolding events. As we approach the end of Trump's first 100 days, we wanted to have Brian on to see if we could find a pattern in all of the chaos. Brian, thanks for coming on The Art Angle.
Thanks, Ben. So glad to be here.
So last year, in the lead up to the election, in October, you wrote a piece called "A Trump Win Could Reshape the Cultural Sector. How is the art world preparing?" And you talked to heads of art schools, artists, museum directors, on and off the record, about how they were thinking about what a Trump administration would mean for arts. It's kind of prophetic reading now. What were people saying then?
Well, there was absolutely an atmosphere of dread. And there were a number of people who were very wary of speaking on the record for very obvious reasons in terms of backlash or calling attention to themselves. Absolutely. And one of the most interesting things to me about it, it was actually inspired by an article in the New York Times about how people in various professions were preparing a resistance to a potential second Trump administration. And so my thesis question going in was, what is the art world doing to prepare? And what I found out was very little. There were not a lot of people who felt like they could prepare. The one person who really said she had a concrete plan was the head of Artistic Freedom Initiative, who's a lawyer who works to get artists who are persecuted in their home countries to America. And she said they were deepening their bench of pro bono lawyers. So that was interesting. But we talked about a lot of things. The atmosphere was really dread looking back to his first term. And as we all were talking about at the time, we anticipated a much more organized and focused second Trump administration, which we've certainly seen. Although at the same time, there was not stated policies. The National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities and Institute for Museum and Library Services, these were not subjects on the campaign trail. They did not appear in Project 2025.
Yeah, I remember when Project 2025 came out, I remember saying to you, Brian, you got to look through that because you're one of our reporters on this sort of story. You got to look through Project 2025, see what to anticipate. And you're like, there's nothing there, actually. It was sort of conspicuous in its absence. That having been said, it's, in my opinion, being sort of conspicuous how much activity there's been around
Absolutely.
Arts and culture. What else did you find?
Well, we looked back at his first term. There was his executive order that federal architecture should be beautiful, that is traditional and conservative rather than the brutalist form of so many federal buildings. At one point, he wanted to zero out funding for the NEA, a real hobby horse for Republicans over decades. Ex-museum director Maxwell Anderson was predicting that he might require patriotic attitudes for government grants supporting the arts, and he was looking back to the decency requirement for NEA grants that was instituted after the Robert Mapplethorpe controversy. He also interestingly pointed out museums possibly being in this sort of Scylla and Charybdis of being criticized from the left for toxic philanthropy and from the right for woke or DEI policies. We looked not only at museums, but also was thinking about art schools. He wanted to eliminate the Department of Education, which could certainly affect art schools. Major funds to higher education come from the DOE. We were concerned about more travel bans, like we reported like crazy on the Muslim ban in the first term and how that affected artists from the countries on the list. And then finally, of course, people were really anxious about how tariffs or other economic policies might hit the art trade, whether they were focused on the art trade or just whether art would get caught up in his wider policies. Memorably, I talked to an art advisor with Auction House experience who said, I'm not too concerned about the big November auctions right about at the time of the election. I am concerned about the future of democracy.
So there's a lot that people were worried about, a lot to think about. Do you get the sense that things are better or worse? Is this what people expected? Have the things that have unfolded been the exact things that people were worrying about? My impression is it's kind of chaos.
Well, people, I think, were selling the danger short. And I think it's been much worse even than the grim picture that was painted in the article with the dismantling of federal agencies that help to fund museums and culture. As you mentioned, the personal takeover of the Kennedy Center, which just seems completely bonkers, how he's going to personally program the performances at the Kennedy Center while being the president is just a comical thought.
In some ways, I wish that was what he focused on exclusively.
I know. So we could bring back Elvis Presley and Cats and, leave the rest to the professionals.
One thing I wanted to ask you before we really get going is what it's like to report on this area right now. People in that original article from October were already pretty wary of being quoted on the record. How is it now?
Well, I'm working on another article, of course, and I have been emailing press reps for museum directors at major museums all over the country and getting silence or we're going to politely decline. And one museum director told me off the record, and I quote, everyone is very scared of speaking up.
Yeah, there's some chatter about museum directors being afraid that kind of museums are next. Ivy League universities have been targeted by Trump as a sort of showpiece in order to flex his muscles, assert his agenda publicly, kind of see who he can bring into line, and that museums might be another target. So people are keeping their heads down, yeah?
Sure, and even outside of the art world, the judge, James Boasberg, who opposed Trump on a matter of legality of his disappearing people, even though he's very much a moderate and is friendly with conservatives, but Trump calls him a radical left lunatic. What museum director is going to want to stick their neck out? I do have a few museum directors who were speaking to me on the record for the forthcoming article, but there's been a lot of silence and a lot of I will only speak off the record.
And I suppose when we get to talking about what's happening at the Smithsonian, there's reason to think that people have cause to be concerned. We'll get to that in a second. Let's get into it. Like I said, it's been a barrage. It's very difficult to keep track of everything. Can you give people just a quick overview of some of the things people are talking about? Is a quick overview even possible? The digest that we have on the site of executive orders that possibly affect the arts runs to, 20 entries or something like that.
Right. It's been exhausting. Absolutely exhausting. And can I give a brief overview? Define brief, but here we go. Let's give it a try. It began from January 20th, an order calling for the elimination of all efforts at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the federal government. And that very quickly led to the shuttering of diversity offices at Smithsonian Institution museums and the National Gallery of Art. It's been an incredibly far-reaching campaign since then, destroying government sources of funding for culture, in other cases using his king-like powers to reach into programming at individual museums as he feels suitable, eliminating funding for the General Services Administration, which oversees the care of 26,000 artworks I've seen reported.
I believe they eliminated their preservation office or a good portion of their preservation office. So
right.
Now you have all these public works of art that have no one taking care of them, essentially.
Right. And shortly after he took office, also the National Endowment for the Arts updated its grant guidelines, canceling grants for so-called underserved audiences, certainly something that the right finds problematic. And also those applying for other grants are instructed to propose funding for initiatives that, quote, celebrate and honor the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or that honor the 250th anniversary.
Which is coming up next year and seems to be a passion project of Trump's or something that he is considering his big cultural initiative. I've heard there are artists or organizations that have gotten grants and they've been canceled, told them that it's no longer appropriate. to the agenda of the government funding, which is now being focused on the semi-sesquicentennial next year.
Very good. You pronounced that very smoothly.
Well, a semi-sesquicentennial doesn't come along every year.
It just doesn't come along every 250 years,
Right.
But also, we can talk about all of this in more detail, but down to the granular level, there was funding was revoked for a show about Anthony Fauci, who Trump perceives as very dangerous to him for telling the truth about COVID. And then they have come for the endowments that fund culture. And as we'll talk about, I think he came after the Smithsonian, specifically targeting its ideology. So it's been very wide-ranging and a barrage at great velocity.
So very early, there was a executive order on cost cutting, on eliminating wasteful government spending. This is most visibly incarnated in Elon Musk's DOGE initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency, that's named after a dog meme. So that gives you a kind of a sense of the kind of culture they're looking to as exemplary. That initiative, seemingly almost firing at random at government programs, sending people in a shock and awe program of cost cutting, has not left arts programming untouched. So tell us about what happened at the Institute of Museum and Library Services.
Yeah, this was actually a really, really interesting story, I think, in a couple of ways. A tipster sent me a Reddit thread where someone was saying that Doge had arrived at the offices, I think it's on L'Enfant Plaza in D.C., of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which has been around since the 60s and has handed out billions of dollars in crucial funding to museums and libraries. And they swore in a new head, Keith Sonderling. And whereas Doge employees had shown up at other government agencies and padlocked the place and sent everybody home immediately, I ended up reaching someone who worked there who explained to me that word got around among IMLS staff that there was going to be a visit from Doge and the Trump administration the next day. And in a sort of final gesture of defiance, everybody who could be at the office that day was at the office doing their job. And this employee felt like it would probably have been that they would all have been dismissed and the place padlocked, but that everyone was there. And he said that they quickly pivoted, they swore in the new head, and then they left. But it only was a reprieve of a couple of weeks, because 2 weeks later, they put, I don't know, I've read different things, all the staff, 85% of the staff, something like that, on administrative leave, revoked grants that had been promised to museums, and that was that.
Well, that's something I just want to get into. For people who don't know, what does the IMLS do?
It's handed out crucial grants to museums and libraries for all sorts of programs and infrastructure. I've been looking at a few examples. I think these are all from 2024. School programs at the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art associated with the Duke Riley Show. The Los Angeles County Museum of Art was researching low environmental impact packaging and crating materials and techniques to move artworks. The Georgia O'Keeffe Museum was funding paid apprenticeship programs for museum registrars and art handlers. Denver Museum, the Walker Art Center, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art all got $250,000 to increase access for visitors with disabilities. I talked to Melissa Cowley-Wolf, who has an advisory firm specializing in philanthropic strategy. And she said when she's in workshops with museum development staff, she will ask them, how many of you got an IMLS grant? And a lot of hands will go up. And she says, keep your hand up if it was one of the most stringent grant applications you ever had to submit, and the hands all stay up. And then she says, and keep your hand up if that grant was absolutely crucial to what your museum does, and the hands all stay up.
Yeah, looking at what this institution does, which is kind of behind the scenes. We talk about
the NEA and the NEH.
Yeah, we talk about those things all the time, and they kind of get the headlines. But what really strikes me about this institution is it's kind of behind the scenes, and it kind of funds the stuff that no one wants to fund. And specifically, a lot of it's education and professional development, which is either the nuts and bolts of how these organizations relate to community, the communities they serve, or professional development, which, for instance, you're talking about development staff. This is professionalization. Like if you're a business person, which supposedly these cuts are about applying business efficiency to the government. I mean, you want your cultural organizations to have a certain level of professionalism and train people up on, what the most efficient best practices are for fundraising and administration. Basic things. That's what's being lost in this efficiency drive.
Yeah. I mean, one of my great regrets as a journalist these days is that for years I had at the bottom of my list or at the back of my mind an article called something like, "Here is the most important museum funder you never heard of." And I've asked a number of museum people whether they would agree with that characterization. And they all say, yeah, definitely. And then, the interesting thing with IMLS too, 19 members of the board of IMLS wrote a letter to Keith Sonderling, the new head and Trump appointee, saying, look, there are legal statutes that were set up to create this organization, and Congress, with the force of law, allocated money to fund it. And what's the story? We'd like to talk. What's the future of IMLS? We'd love to talk to you about this in open session. And within hours, literally, all these board members of IMLS received emails dismissing them from those positions. So stand up to the administration for illegality, you simply lose your position.
And we should say, there have been lawsuits about this, right?
Yeah, exactly. Ironically, I was on the phone with a museum director who said to me, no one is coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. When I got a chat from my editor pointing out that at that moment it was 20 state attorneys general. It ended up being 21 by the end of the day, suing the Trump administration, saying it's unlawful to simply dissolve an organization that was created by a legal statute and to which Congress appropriated money with the force of law. What will become of that lawsuit? I don't know. If we're not seeing people go to jail for contempt of court in these various ways that the Trump administration is simply defying judges' orders, I don't know if it's going to be IMLS that sends somebody to jail for contempt of court. We'll see.
I think it is an important point in the sense that we're talking about things that have happened or are happening, but what they mean is actually a little bit up in the air. It's a little bit lawless. I mean, it's a little bit like throwing a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, there was a great conversation with an expert on The Daily that I heard where the guest was pointing out that literally we are operating outside of the law. It's not like you can necessarily say in some cases that Doge and Elon Musk are breaking laws because there just aren't laws that govern them because they're not a government department and they weren't created by statute. So we're literally just outside of the law.
I want to get into the Smithsonian. I mean, that's the other big case that kicked off at the end of March. It is really on people's minds because the Smithsonian's such a symbolic institution and because this particular executive order is so unsettling. So tell us about what happened at the Smithsonian.
Yeah, and with the Smithsonian, of course, the stakes couldn't be higher. Some museums maybe can adjust if they don't get funds from NEA or NEH or IMLS, but Smithsonian receives nearly 2/3 of its budget, $1 billion budget from the federal government. The executive order objects to what Trump calls a revisionist movement that's looking to undermine the remarkable achievements of the United States, in his words. And he claims that the Smithsonian specifically is promoting divisive race-centered ideology and that it portrays American and Western values as inherently harmful and oppressive. And in the same executive order, and this is something that he got onto in 2020 during the post-George Floyd murder moment when monuments to racists and Confederates were being torn down, in the same executive order, he said that public monuments and memorials and statues and markers that were removed should be replaced. And so we know where that's going.
We're talking about replacing Confederate sculptures that were taken down. And in the same order, he very specifically targets a show currently at the Smithsonian that is about the role of sculpture in enforcing racist ideas of history, right?
Right. The show The Shape of Power, Stories of Race and American Sculpture is the title of the show. And he singles this show out as promoting that divisive ideology. The museum describes it as examining the role of sculpture in understanding and constructing the concept of race. And of course, they don't want to hear anything about how race is a construct.
It's really striking because in the executive order, they single out as particularly offensive the specific language that says, like, this show promotes the idea, and then in scare quotes, something like race is a construct. That is like an uncontroversial point. It's not even an academic point. It's just to say that race is a socially determined thing. There's no real deep biological differences between different people that have any sort of higher determination.
Right. Right. And this isn't some wacky show. I mean, it's at a Smithsonian museum. It had support from the Henry Luce Foundation and the Ford Foundation, and a catalog published by the Princeton University Press, an exhibition organized to the highest of standards in the academic and museum world.
The order cites as specific examples of this ideology they say has captured museums. I mean, it really does seem to be their gambit to, like, basically bring museums in a line to signal exactly what they want. They seem totally random to me, to be honest. They cite this one specific show that's currently on, and then some theoretical stuff at a future women's history museum.
Of women, right. Right, because it is supposedly going to include trans women, and they deny the existence of trans people. They say there are only two genders, and you have to be the gender that you were assigned at birth, is their belief. And also, of course, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that I really would imagine could only seem like an intolerably woke enterprise in itself.
It's interesting. I was reading Nate Freeman's article about this in Vanity Fair, and he points out that during his first term, Trump very famously went to the museum and was very complimentary. Things seem to have changed.
Great work being done by great people, he called it.
Yeah, that's right.
But then the founding director of the museum, Lonnie Bunch, and now secretary of the Smithsonian, pointed out that this is such a wonderful, chilling, awful story. They were looking at a display about how European countries, including the Netherlands, were involved in the slave trade, and Trump looked at it for a second and then said, "You know, they love me in the Netherlands."
Yeah, that was his reaction to that.
That was his take. And when the White House comms secretary was asked about that by the New York Times, they said, Bunch is a failure and his book is trash and he lied. They kept it real classy as usual.
That anecdote does in some ways seem to represent what Trump actually wants out of the Smithsonian's language, or the language around art. So what is it exactly that this executive order mandates that people have found so alarming?
Well, I think it's a bit vague, actually, in some ways, in that it appoints J.D. Vance to look at the Smithsonian Institution museums and root out what he's calling this divisive, race-centered ideology. Of course, having no seeming awareness that they also operate from an ideology, as we all do. But they claim that they are coming from a position only of truth, that only truth will be represented. And that truth, of course, has to be flattering to the United States. And this has been historically an issue. I mean, there was an exhibition about the Enola Gay in 1995 that had the temerity to suggest that the dropping of the bomb on Japan was not good for the Japanese people, and it was met with a firestorm of criticism. So this kind of thing goes back decades, but this is at a level of specificity, of control, and granularity that is alarming. Granularity and breadth at the same time.
The thought of J.D. Vance sitting down and reviewing all the wall text and didactics for the several dozen Smithsonian Institution museums, in some sense, it would be amusing and heartening to think that that's what they were dedicating their time to, but it is just very improbable. It seems more like an intent to have a chilling effect on arts and culture. Except, in some sense, it does seem like Trump really thinks that this can happen. I mean, there's a little story that I wrote. In this order, he mandates that J.D. Vance be in charge of the ideology of Smithsonian alongside the assistant to the president for domestic policy and the special assistant to the president and senior associate staff secretary. The titles of a single person, Lindsay Halligan, who is one of Trump's lawyers from the period when he was living at Mar-a-Lago and the FBI was raiding the complex looking for documents, she was one of the very few lawyers who represented him and has become kind of his all-purpose staff secretary. Seemingly, she's in this order, the only person mentioned in the order by name, just because he's taking a personal interest in it and wants someone close to him to report directly to him. I happen to notice that her title is also on the executive order about NEH grants, saying that she's going to be reviewing them to make sure that they correspond to the spirit of the semi-sesquicentennial. So a lot of power being concentrated in someone who is a former insurance lawyer with really unclear qualifications.
It's a brilliant example of the kind of thing that we see with this administration again and again and again, where people who have shown personal support for Trump, again, in his lawbreaking, get high positions for which they have zero qualifications. It's just so typical.
Okay, there is way too much to talk about. I do want, before we end, to spare a moment for, I think, I don't know what to call it, favorite example of cultural causes that Trump seems to be obsessed with, which is the new Heroes Sculpture Garden initiative. And most recently, it came out that he is diverting funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities away from their previously stated goals towards this pet project. What is this? Why is this?
To step back for just a second, on April 4th, the staff at the National Endowment for the Humanities was placed on leave and over 1,000 grants were terminated, again, illegally. And this organization has been operating since 1965 and has given out $6 billion to cultural institutions, like programs for teachers at museums, digitization projects at libraries, collections preservation, professional training. The NEH helped to fund Ken Burns' beloved Civil War TV series and the King Tut Museum tour in 1979. So just to give a context, and now this funding is going to be diverted to this National Garden of American Heroes with figures like Thomas Edison and Mark Twain and George Washington and Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant. I admire the man's athleticism, and he did engage in some philanthropy, but how he belongs in this company, I'm not quite sure. And also, it's American heroes, but it goes back as far as Christopher Columbus and other people who helped to colonize this territory.
This is a new initiative. Where did it come from?
Deep in the gray matter of our senescent president, I can only imagine. I don't know. And I mean, to be fair, we should also say that some figures who are totally universally admired, like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, also are slotted to be included there. But it would seem comical, but it's in keeping with, as we talked about, the illegal taking of money from all these places to their own ends. And one of my, again, like you say, I don't know what to call it, favorite, most dreadful examples, we're stepping outside of the art world here for a minute, but the $400 million that Trump clawed back from Columbia University because they supposedly did not protect the Jewish community during the protests over the Israel war in Gaza. Trump's campaign website said, we are going to get money back from these universities to build our own university where there won't be any wokeness or jihadism allowed. I only learned about that because the Columbia faculty unions are also suing about that $400 million initial taking, and it's really a $5 billion relationship, as our lawsuit put it. And so Trump had a crack at creating a university once, and it was a failure, and now he wants another bite at the apple. And if he can get that money from these cultural organizations, and who knows, maybe from museums through taxing their endowments or whatever sinister moves there might be, yeah, I think there's potentially a lot more to come.
So I just know two more things about this Heroes Sculpture Garden before we move on to what pattern you find in all this. Although these are both kind of patterns you do find in the mix. This was an initiative from his end of his first term. Is when people were tearing down monuments during the Black Lives Matter protests. And this was sort of his reply to that, was to propose this National Garden of Heroes. And the language around this initiative, which has no location so far. I know the governor of South Dakota is asking for it to be cited there. But The idea of heroes is very important, that he wants a heroic narrative. And that is behind a lot of this, is this kind of idea that people should be proud of their country, make America great again, kind of means let's forget all the bad stuff. And this idea of heroes is very important, it seems to me. It's a very weird and scattershot idea of American heroes. I mean, it ranges from Andrew Jackson, the proto-populist president who was behind the Trail of Tears, to Hannah Arendt, the author of The Origins of Totalitarianism.
And super conservative Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia and televangelist Billy Graham. It's a wild array of figures to be heroized.
And then the second thing that's really striking about it is, you know, you almost imagine it in all caps in the executive order. I don't think it is. But the idea that it's like, it would be in realist, not modernist or abstract styles. That's part of this. Throughout all these actions, there's kind of hostility to expertise and actually attempt to paint these kind of like cultural forces that are like alien, that have like occupied the government, whether it's in the executive orders around architecture, which are very specifically against brutalist architecture as associating it with social engineering and wanting us to go back to regional and classical styles associated with Europe, or these ideas about diverting funds for America's birthday, or even some of the people he puts in charge of these things, like Keith Sonderling, who he put in charge of the IMLS as it was cut. He's an employment lawyer. He doesn't know anything about libraries or museums specifically. Like, there's a real hostility to expertise.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
But last thing before we go, I mean, this is chaos. And like you've said, is coming from all sides, and there's a real haphazard and almost improvised quality to it. Some of these executive orders, people claim, have the hallmarks of being written with ChatGPT.
As the trade tariffs were also, some people are saying, calculated with ChatGPT.
Yeah. What patterns do you see? Can you help people make sense of this? What do you see, or what are people saying is beneath all this?
This is just me, but I just don't think there's any question. But as you say, that there's an incredible disdain for what we think about as advanced and important cultural expression. But I think underneath all of it is a desire to stamp out all dissenting speech and thought. And museums and libraries are important places where people gain knowledge, have access to information that is a prerequisite for being able to think critically and learn about dissenting views, and it just all has to be silenced. And we've seen that in his going after law firms and disappearing people off the street who have engaged in speech that is disfavored. And then as a parallel look at, I was just reading about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's campaign to remove books from the Naval Academy and Library. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is off the shelf, but Mein Kampf stays on.
Wow.
It tells you everything that you need to know, I think. And of course, the notion that it's about saving government money is absurd. When you think about the minuscule fraction of government spending that's represented by an organization like IMLS, that if I remember right is something like 0.00045% of the national budget against the enormous subsidies that the government hands out to oil and gas companies and big pharma and giveaways and tax breaks for hedge funds. It just doesn't pass the laugh test that it's about the money. I really think it's about stamping out the ability to develop critical thinking and critical expression. Nothing less.
Well, Brian, it's a sobering note to end on, but I think that's where we're at right now. And at least right now, you never know what will happen next, and I'm sure you'll be on top of it.
I will do my best. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review The Art Angle. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.